A commonly mentioned example of an undesigned coincidence is about why in John 6:5, Jesus asked Philip where to get food for the crowd before miraculously feeding the 5,000. The explanation relies on details from John and Luke. In John, in an unrelated passage, we learn that Philip came from Bethsaida, while Luke independently says that the feeding happened there. In Luke's story, the place is mentioned, but Philip's role isn't. In contrast, John doesn't specify the location, but does mention that Philip is from Bethsaida and tells us about Jesus asking Philip. This makes sense as an undesigned coincidence if Philip knew the area well and its local food joints. This natural fit of details is what we might expect when both accounts are based on eyewitness testimony. As you'd anticipate, critics have questioned and tried to downplay the significance of these connected details. Let's take a look at a few of the concerns they've raised. First, they argue that it's clear that the feeding didn't happen in Bethsaida. Both Mark and Matthew describe the location as a deserted place. What's more, in Luke 9:12, just a few verses later, the disciples refer to their location as in a desert place. It seems like this place was quite remote, so much so that the disciples planned to send the crowds not directly to Bethsaida, which would make sense if they were nearby, but instead the surrounding towns and countryside. This suggests that they were in a distant, out-of-the-way area, not specifically in or near Bethsaida. John's account allegedly supports this view too. In John 6:3, he notes that Jesus went to the mountain. While he doesn't say which mountain, it fits with the Gospel's consistent story that this event happened in a remote, unpopulated area, not in a known town. Given this information, it seems the feeding happened far away from any specific town, making Philip's local knowledge far less important. To explain away this undesigned coincidence, here is Matthew Hartke and Ben the Amateur Exegete.
Bring up the point about editorial fatigue here, that in Mark, Jesus feeds this multitude, in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, feeds the multitude in a desolate place. And that's why the question about finding food for them makes sense, because there's nowhere to get food anywhere close. And that is why then that is the kind of the big that is why the miracle is such a wow. There's no food to get anywhere around here. We're a long ways from any town. What are we going to do for all these people out here in the middle of nowhere? So Jesus performs the miracle. In Luke takes the story over from Mark, but he sets it in Bethsaida. This happens just outside of Bethsaida. But then he slips into talking about, when the disciples asked them the question, "Oh, well, we're here in this desolate place. Where are we going to get food?" Well, you're right there at this this town, Bethsaida. Like, there's food there. You can just walk right up there and get some food.
That's a mean thing to say about a town.
It doesn't make any sense. So what it seems, and this is Marc Goodacre's point about editorial fatigue, is that in this instance, it appears that Luke has just taken this story from Mark, and he relocates it to Bethsaida, but then he slips back into the language of his source, where it's a desolate place, even though that doesn't fit with his redaction in placing it in Bethsaida.
In response to this, it's important to understand that when the text mentions a desert place, it could possibly mean uncultivated grazing land. This detail could explain why there was an abundance of grass, as mentioned in Mark 6:39. Furthermore, when the disciples suggest sending the people to the surrounding towns, it makes sense because Bethsaida was close to Capernaum, Chorazin, Gennesaret, Magdala, places where people were likely from. Having 5,000 hungry travelers, plus women and children, according to Matthew 14:21, all gather in a single location probably would not be practical, especially when these towns were only a few miles apart. Even if the event didn't happen right in Bethsaida, it must have been quite nearby. Let me illustrate with a real-world example. I have a friend who was born and raised in Iowa, and in the state, people often identify with the largest town in the region. For instance, my friend would say they're from Cedar Rapids, even though they grew up in a smaller city of Palo, which is about 13 miles away from town. Did my friend technically grow up in Cedar Rapids? No. However, my friend knows everything about Cedar Rapids and the surrounding area, including every hill, forest, creek, pond, and neighborhood. What I'm getting at is that it's not necessary to emphasize that they were a little ways away from Bethsaida. If this somewhere is clearly in the same general area where Bethsaida is located, then Philip, being a local resident, would have known the entire region around Bethsaida better than someone from somewhere else. So the important question here is whether this deserted place is in the general vicinity of Bethsaida. If it is, well, the undesigned coincidence still holds. Okay, so what about editorial fatigue? In a nutshell, New Testament scholar Marc Goodacre has a theory called editorial fatigue in the Gospels. He says that when one writer relies heavily on another's work, they might make changes at the beginning of the story that they can't maintain throughout. Goodacre thinks this is best shown in the feeding of the 5,000 accounts. He points to Mark 6:35 through 36 and Luke 9:12 as an example. In Mark 6:35 through 36 it reads, "When it got late, Jesus' disciples came to him and said, 'This place is deserted and it's getting late. Send the people away to the nearby villages to buy food.'" Luke 9:12 says, "As the day was ending, the 12 disciples said, 'Send the crowd to the nearby villages and countryside till find a place to stay and get something to eat, because we're in a deserted place.'" In his article, Fatigue in the Synoptics, Goodacre comments, "The adjective used by both Mark and Luke is eremos, lonely, desolate, abandoned. Clearly it is nonsense to say that we are here in a desolate place when in the Lucan setting they are not. After all, if the crowd were in a city, they would not need to go to the surrounding villages and countryside to find food and lodging. Further, since in Bethsaida food and lodging ought to be close at hand, Luke's comment that the day was drawing to a close lacks any relevance, and consequently the feeding lacks the immediate motive that it has in Mark. In short, by relocating the feeding of the 5,000 without being able to sustain the new setting with its fresh implications throughout, Luke has spoilt the story. But in my view, this argument is incredibly weak. Goodacre has created a problem that doesn't even exist. When the disciples mention the nearby places where the people could buy food, it suggests that the desolate place wasn't far from those villages and the countryside. As mentioned earlier, Bethsaida's location is used in a regional sense, which is the most natural way to interpret Luke's account. Additionally, Matthew, which most scholars believe was not directly based on Luke, but used some common source material, also suggests that they were in a desolate place. Furthermore, the independent evidence from the coincidence discussed earlier supports Luke's location for the feeding of the 5,000. Critics also argue that the question's importance regarding Philip diminishes when we realize that both Philip and his fellow disciples, Andrew and Peter, are all mentioned as being from Bethsaida in John 1:44. Essentially, from the very beginning, 3 of the 12 disciples have ties to Bethsaida. Additionally, Philip has a much more significant role in John's Gospel than in the Synoptics, with his name appearing around a dozen times. In the Synoptics, Philip never even speaks. Here again is Matthew Hartke and Ben the Amateur Exegete arguing this very point.
Why Philip? Why not Peter and Andrew? Right? Because, so here's John chapter 1, verse 44. Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. So why focus on Philip if the reason that is being proposed here is that he's from Bethsaida? There's other options here. You've got two other disciples.
That kind of diminishes.
Peter.
If 3 out of 12 of them are from Bethsaida, then that does kind of water down the point. It's not just the one guy who's from there. He could have asked any of them. And the fact that Philip is a prominent character in John's Gospel is another point that waters down the proposed undesigned coincidence there, because Philip appears several times throughout the Gospel. John is more interested in Philip. So there you go.
In response to this, the main point of the coincidence argument is that Philip isn't nearly as prominent among the disciples as Peter is in any of the 4 Gospels. It's more logical to expect Peter to be questioned, or perhaps Judas because he had the money bag. But really, this whole objection misses the point. John mentions that Philip is from Bethsaida, but this detail is mentioned in different parts of the Gospel. It isn't directly linked to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. If John had fabricated the conversation between Jesus and Philip in John 6:5, he likely would have mentioned Bethsaida as the place of the miracle or Philip's origin. However, in Luke's account, there's no mention of Philip in this context, but he does state that the event happened in Bethsaida. The most straightforward explanation for this coincidence is that the stories are based on real events. The critics' explanation might be possible, but it's not very likely. Additionally, rather than diluting the significance by noting that both Philip and Andrew hail from Bethsaida, it's interesting to consider Andrew's statement to Jesus in John 6:9. He says, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they for so many?" One might speculate that Andrew, being from Bethsaida, where this miracle occurred, knew the boy, or perhaps Jesus had directed his question towards Philip and Andrew, both of whom were locals. Lastly, Philip speaks only on a handful of occasions in John's Gospel. I don't believe that this small sample size provides significant enough grounds to conclude that Philip holds a major role in John's Gospel, so the coincidence still seems to hold. To strengthen the critic's case, let's provide a more compelling argument against the reliability of the accounts here. It appears that there is a big contradiction in the narratives. In Luke 9:10, it said that the feeding of the 5,000 happened in Bethsaida, but in Mark 6:45, there seems to be a contradiction because Jesus tells his disciples to go to Bethsaida after the miracle. This raises a serious question. Why send them to Bethsaida if they were already there? To address this, consider a few key points. First, there's the evidence that the event did happen near Bethsaida, which is backed by other details in the account. This gives us a good reason to believe that it occurred in Bethsaida. Mark's account also suggests that they were too busy with the crowds before the feeding and needed to get away. This aligns with their location near Capernaum before they left. John's account, mentioning the crowds heading to Jerusalem for Passover, supports the idea of them traveling from the Capernaum region, passing by Bethsaida, and then returning to the northwest side, landing at Gennesaret. This explanation supports their direction of travel. The Greek preposition pros can be translated as over against or across from, but I'm not convinced of this interpretation at the moment. While pros can indeed mean against in some cases, I don't know of any instances in the New Testament or the Greek Septuagint where it clearly means geographically opposite to, as suggested by this interpretation. Another possibility is that when Mark said to the other side, he meant that they were passing near Bethsaida, indicating the actual location of the feeding was slightly east of Bethsaida. In this interpretation, Bethsaida is again used in a regional sense, like saying you live in a city when you technically live in the suburbs, as we've already discussed. Another option, which goes against the idea of biblical inerrancy, is that Mark's source, likely Peter, made a small error when reporting the event. Mistakes in speech do happen, and such an error in an insignificant detail would not render the entire account unreliable. In summary, although there appears to be a contradiction between Mark and Luke's accounts, various explanations can reconcile this difference, and the presence of such variations actually serves to highlight the independence of Mark and Luke's accounts. The claim that Mark and Luke's accounts contradict each other in some kind of devastating way just doesn't hold up. The argument that a deserted place excludes the possibility of it being Bethsaida is unconvincing, and adding editorial fatigue to the explanation doesn't really explain much of anything. Furthermore, suggesting that Philip has a significant role in John's gospel based on his limited mentions, particularly in relation to the bread question in John 6:5 and the mention of his hometown in John 1:44, doesn't fit the casual and unrelated nature of these passages to Luke's account of the feeding in Luke 9:10. Therefore, the example of why Philip still serves as a strong example of an undesigned coincidence, and evidence supporting the theory that memory is the best explanation for the data we have in the Gospels rather than legendary embellishment.